This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Rich Tommaso. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And today we have the pleasure of talking with Rich Tommaso. Issue number 1 of his new series, She-Wolf, came out just last week, as did the trade of Dark Corridor. So we have a fun time talking with Rich. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off at the cover price. And every month, you'll find some incredible specials. Sometimes you'll find those specials discounted at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that go higher than that.
That's right, and we're coming up on the end of June, so when this goes up, it'll probably be the beginning of July, and so the new July orders won't be up yet, but you can count on them having a load of discounts, including bundles from some of the major publishers in their catalog.
That's right. And, if you still want to get your June order in, if you're slack like me and you haven't done it yet, then they don't mind late orders. So that's another great reason to go with Discount Comic Book Service. Check out their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, late and otherwise. And after you do pre-order your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, we have a good time talking with Rich. Both you and I met him separately at Heroes Con about a week and a half ago. And I guess we could have talked to him there at the con, but we had been talking already about doing more of a leisurely one-on-one interview, and I'm glad we waited.
Yeah, I'm glad we did too. I mean, in a lot of ways, this conversation kind of picked up where we left off with him at Heroes Con, but I think people coming into it will get a good sense of what to expect if they haven't picked up She-Wolf or Dark Corridor yet.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and give that a listen. We're here with Rich Tommaso. His new title, She-Wolf, issue number 1, was released last week from Image Comics, and also released at the same time was the trade of Dark Corridor. Rich, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So how does it feel to have both titles come out the same week?
It feels great, actually. I think She-Wolf, I don't think Dark Corridor got a lot of press before its release, but She-Wolf has just been, it seems to be getting a lot of press, so I think that's really helping both books. It seems to be helping, it's definitely helping She-Wolf, but it's helping to point people to Dark Corridor as well, so it's great to have that all collected so someone can read the whole thing in one book.
So if you were describing She-Wolf to someone who, not only hasn't read this issue.
Elevator pitch.
Yes, but someone who's not even familiar with your comics as a whole, how would you do that?
Okay, I messed this up twice on the podcast. Let me see if I can get it right this time. It's kind of like a coming of age story, but not in the same way where people grow and learn how to kind of live life the right way. It's kind of like the opposite of that, where it's a girl that kind of gets more, she kind of gets more embittered about things as she finds out more about her family and adult life. See, I'm really bad at the to create. I came up with a good one, but of course I forgot it now.
When you said screwed it up in the past, I thought you just went ahead and described another book.
No, I went on and on and on.
It's a magical land of Westeros. But now, She-Wolf is also more kind of in the horror genre, I guess, especially than Dark Corridor was. So what went into deciding to kind of shift into a different genre here?
Well, I mean, a lot of it had to do with how Dark Corridor sold. It kind of, the sales kind of dropped pretty bad at the end, and I thought, well, maybe crime isn't the thing right now. Maybe I should just try something else. So I thought, well, I like doing horror, so I'll do a take on horror. And when I wrote it, it was kind of like a straightforward story, very much the way Dark Corridor is a straightforward crime comic. But then I thought of a more surreal way to go with the story, and ended up just tossing out everything I'd written for She-Wolf. So it's really different in a lot of ways. I'm drawing it a little differently, and even the writing is very different. I've had to rewrite a lot of the scripts for the issues again and again because they were very straightforward, and I just wanted to write in a different way, like convey the information with as little information as possible.
But this isn't the first horror comic that you've written before. Right. Years ago, you had the horror of Collier County.
Yeah, that was like the second thing. Cannibal Porn was the first thing I ever did. It was an Arrows comic that I got published, and right. Some of the characters from that carry over into the horror of Collier County. And yeah, I've always seemed to do takes on vampires, but I've always wanted to do a werewolf book. But there's so much. There's so much in the lore. There's so little, I should say, in the lore of that. It's kind of hard to come up with something that I could do in long form about werewolves. But I always wanted to do a comic like that, so I said, no, okay, now is the time.
One of the things that struck me about this first issue of She-Wolf is that it's a different kind of story than we're used to when it comes to, let's say, single issue of comic books. In that after reading this, the word impressionistic immediately came to mind. In other words, we're given a series of scenarios and scenes that are obviously linked in a variety of ways. But at the same time, there's not the continuity that I think most people expect in a comic. But that's fine because I'm expecting a lot of these pieces to come together more coherently in the issues to come. But, I thought that was an effective way to begin this series with these almost snapshots of what's going on in Gabby's life.
Yeah, that was I'd written the 4 scripts for the first story arc, the first 4 issues makes a pretty solid story in and of itself. It could end at 4 issues, but when I thought about them about a week later, just for some reason I had this completely different idea of how I could tell the story go through my mind, and maybe it was because I had already written everything down and thought everything's pretty much straightforwardly written out, everything's kind of clearly explained, and I thought there's got to be a more interesting way to do this story and still kind of convey that information. I know I've heard a few people say this comic doesn't seem to make sense, and I know there's a lot of Image comics that are really strange and kind of hard to figure out, and it does make sense. A lot of this stuff I've written out. It's just that when I look over the scripts again, this is just these characters are basically explaining what's going on to the reader. There's got to be a more interesting way to do this. And with werewolves and things like werewolves and vampires, there's the characters kind of afflicted by these curses. They're always having nightmares and dreams and things like that. So I thought, okay, if someone's suffering through nightmares because they're going through this transformation in their life, that could totally work as a way of the nightmares bleeding into the reality, so that it looks like you have this confusing story, but these things do make sense.
That's interesting, because when I think about Dark Corridor, one of the things I really appreciate about it is how it bears careful reading and careful rereading, because the timelines shift and so on, and it doesn't follow a straight chronological narrative, and so I'm feeling with the first issue of She-Wolf that I'm getting that same vibe that if something's not clear, I'm going to be I'll be along for the ride, and it'll make sense later, and even require me to go back and reread, and that's fine.
Yeah, I hope so. I feel like there are things where I've written things out pretty clearly and pretty, where the character's basically telling you what's happening, or through the scene it's very clear what's going on. And then I'll just reinterpret that scene later and say, well, I could really just draw this happening and have very little said here, but that same information is still there, but it might be a little harder to pick up, And I thought it's just an interesting way to do something dreamlike or surreal with this comic. I've always wanted to write that way, and I've tried for past 20 years. Every once in a while, I'll kind of try that out, writing something in a kind of surreal manner, and it always comes out seeming a little forced, or like a bad David Lynch script or something, like a bad copy of David Lynch. And so I always scrap it. But with this, it just kind of one night all came to me. I just kind of reshuffled the scenes that I had written in issue 1 in a completely different manner, and just sat down and started writing the script without being logical or worrying about whether it was going to make sense, just kind of following these ideas that were in my head. And then the next day I was like, oh, okay, this still makes sense to me, at least. I'll go ahead with this. But it's been difficult because it's been difficult keeping that up. The second issue you get gives you a lot more clarity on what's happening to her and what's going on. But the third issue, again, when I wrote it, it was literally like two characters talking to each other, but basically explaining everything to the reader. And I thought, I can't do this. And I wrote the script 4 different times, and I finally came up with a way to convey all the things I wanted to convey, but in a much more surreal kind of way, a much more mysterious kind of fashion. But everything's there if you can pick it up. So it's difficult keeping that up. And I knew that when I said, okay, if I follow this version, this would be really interesting, but I sure hope I can keep this up, issue after issue.
So you say that this first narrative arc of She-Wolf is 4 issues, and if it doesn't go as well as you would like, you feel that you could comfortably end it after issue number 4, but you could continue the story.
Yeah, I'm telling a short story that I really want to tell, and I think it would be just fine on its own, but I certainly have come up with more that this could go on, like more material for it to go on, so with more characters and a longer ranging plot. So,
well, let me follow up by asking you if your decision to structure this series in the way you plan on doing, was that in many ways determined by your experience with Dark Corridor?
Yeah, very much so. If I could have gone back and done things differently, I might have edited a few things out of Dark Corridor. Maybe done 4 issues first and put out a trade just to get that you kind of get a new audience that doesn't really want to buy the single issues. They kind of wait for the trade, and I really didn't give it a chance to get that second audience. It was supposed to be 6 issues, but the sales had dropped so dramatically that I said, well, maybe I should just do a thick issue 7, just wrap the whole story up. I was looking at my notes for what would have been like a season 2 of that series, and it was very lean. And I thought, well, with what's gone on in the story, where there's only a few characters kind of left over, I could probably just do this in 1 extra issue. And when I made that decision, they decided to push the trade back from March to June, because they thought, well, might as well just put all 7 in the trade. So, yeah, a lot of those things kind of were rough on me financially with Dark Quarter. So now I'm thinking, okay, let me try to write these stories as 4-issue stories that I could be happy with, and just see where they go from there. Because I don't want to get into the point where I'm basically in debt. That issues are like not only not making money, but I'm actually owing money.
Well, that's something that Andy and I have discussed often on the Comics Alternative, and that is, our the questions that we have about how creators through Image decide what they do. How viable a series is going to be for them when they make the decisions that they make and why they make them. So this information that you're telling us about your experience with Dark Corridor is really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's why Image is a great fit for me, because when I was doing my own comic books, when I'm self-publishing comics, I went back to self-publishing a few years ago just because I couldn't find anyone to publish any of my work. I was working on 6 different things, and so it was really easy for me to kind of jump from one thing to the next. And I'm always coming up with new ideas, so it's fine for me to say, okay, I have a way I can end this one and just go on to something else, because there's plenty of other things I want to do. So, I'm already thinking of what I want to do after She-Wolf. So.
Do you think that you'll get back to the world that you started to explore in Dark Corridor? Because I remember in that first issue of Dark Corridor, in the artist notes at the back, you mentioned that these were some story ideas that you've had for a long time. And if I remember correctly, the way that you were describing this sounded rather ambitious.
Yeah, both of the Red Circle was... The Red Circle storyline was a script. It's based on a script that I wrote back in 2009, and I was going to do an unofficial, modern remake of Jim Thompson's Pop 1280 as a comic book, using Atlanta as the backdrop, because I just thought, I've been living here for about 16 years, and just knowing all the people, I just thought, wow, there's so many similarities there. I could do something like that. So it was similar to that novel, but set in my time period with Atlanta characters. And so that was a very long story, and so was the 7 Deadly Daughters. They all had personal histories, and then there was a lot more to actually explaining how they got their training so that they could take on the mob. And so I do hope at some point I can go back and do something, maybe with a different title, but just to further explore that territory again. We'll see. It's hard. It seems like crime is not the big seller over at Image. I feel like a lot of comics that have been canceled over there have been crime comics, and a lot of people who do pretty well selling comics and stuff, it seems like their lowest sellers are crime stuff. So yeah, maybe it's just not a very popular genre right now. I don't know. Unless you have a big name, I think it's kind of hard.
Well, even Ed Brubaker's The Fade Out ended after 10 issues.
11.
Or it was 11, okay.
Yeah, and I think I'd have to say his criminal stuff at Image, just a few things he's done over there, if you look at that versus the numbers of his Velvet comic, it's so different. It's just vastly different in as far as the sales. So yeah, I don't know. I think it might just be crime is kind of maybe it's just kind of an older generation genre, unless it's done in a specific way. I think the themes, especially the kind of stuff that I write about, which is very much like 50s noir stories, depressed old men, and you gotta kind of look at that and say, well, who's relating to this stuff when you think about young readers reading Image comics?
I don't know. Rich, when we were at HeroesCon, we talked at length about a lot of different crime novelists, and I don't know if it was just timing when, for example, when I got into Jim Thompson. It was probably around the time that there was that little kind of Jim Thompson resurgence when the movies After Dark, My Sweet, and
early
the Grifters had come out. Yeah, and so I guess early 90s. So I guess I was in my early 20s then. So but man, I tore into those books at that time.
Yeah, me as well. I when I did my first graphic novel for Fantagraphics, the Clover Honey crime novel, Gary Groth likened it to Jim Thompson, and I did this like Spin magazine interview, and they saying like, "Yeah, it reminds me of Jim Thompson." I didn't even know who Jim Thompson was, and I'm like, "God, I got to read this guy." So yeah, 20s, like that was 93, so it was probably 23, 24. Yeah, and I just ate it up as soon as I started reading his stuff. I just would go out and buy everything I could find from him. Yeah, there's an authenticity there that just can't be understated. There's just so much of that you can tell is just comes from his life. And
but there's one of the connections I make between your work and Thompson, especially something like Dark Corridor, is your narrative experimentation. Thompson has so many books in which he's just, he's telling what should just be a pulp crime story, but he's doing these really kind of innovative and interesting things with narrative order and stuff like that. And I'm thinking of like The Kill Off and The Killer Inside Me, and
Killer Inside Me, definitely,
and Pop 1280 too. But so I see that in Dark Corridor as well, the way that shifts between points of view and perspective and timelines.
Yeah, that's another thing I thought that would make for interesting storytelling. So that, since there were so many characters, I didn't want the character Pete in the first issue. I didn't really want him to become the main character as such. So I always wanted to shift the narratives around, since there were so many characters, and not just pin it down to you just watching everything from this one guy's point of view. I thought, why not just shift it from issue to issue to a different character, and they're all involved in the same goings on, whether they know about it or not. So I thought I'd play around with that, and that's something also that The Wire does really well.
Yeah.
You kind of think, what's his name? What's his name? The Irish guy. You kind of take him as the main character.
Oh, McNulty,
yeah.
McNulty, yeah. How could I forget their name? And then it'll shift from character to character. I think that's really great. You just get a broader view of what's going on.
Well, in fact, that's a genre, crime writing, that I tend to think of you. Doing well, and I guess because my first introduction to your work was Clover Honey, but you've done a bit of that even since then. There's that study group story from a couple of years ago, Dry County. There's the Cavalier Mr. Thompson, and then there's Dark Corridor. So, I mean, this seems to be a genre that you tend to gravitate toward, even though it doesn't seem to be paying off for you, at least lately, with Dark Corridor.
Yeah, I know. I hope I can crack some kind of code at some point. And I do think crime is like any other classic genre, or even like classic drawing styles, as far as that stuff goes. It always comes back and forth. Like, it'll come back in the style and go away. So I'm kind of hoping there's another resurgence, much like the 90s with the Jim Thompson novels and all those movies coming out. I kind of hope it does come back on an upswing, because I tend to have most of my scripts are crime stories. So yeah, I would like to go back to that again at some time and do more with it. When I started doing Recoil, I pretty much made the decision that I was going to do only crime novels from now on. So yeah, maybe a little sad to have to veer away from it.
So what would be some other crime writers that you feel either as influences or ones that you like to go to?
Charles Willeford is a big one for me. When I read, I remember I'd read all of Charles Bukowski's work except for Pulp, because I thought, that's it. After that, I can't read anything else. And I just had this idea of what it would be like, and I said, it's probably just like a really very realistic, gritty, slice of life kind of story. Of course, it's not. It's just an insane very, very pulpy story. And I guess the title was perfect for that. But when I came to Charles Willeford's Miami Blues series, that was what I was expecting the Charles Bukowski book to be like. This very, very realistic, humdrum sort of book about a detective. And yeah, a lot of Dry County is inspired by his writing, and and I just love it because whenever something does happen, when someone's killed, or there is something really some kind of crime dramatic moment that happens in his books, it has such an impact because you're reading, you feel like you're reading this everyday life kind of book, so it feels all the more real when things like that occur.
Are you a fan of the Miami Blues movie?
No. I've tried it out a couple of times. Yeah. I don't know. There's just too many things that are off about it. Yeah, for me.
I wanted, after seeing that, though, to see. I thought Fred Ward was really well.
Yeah, he was well cast. Yeah, he was a good choice for that. But yeah, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that remade. I think that there's a movie called Killing Them Softly that I thought was really good. Trying to remember the author of the book, but that was really well done. It was even though it was made in the 2000s, it still felt like it was the 70s, even just because they kind of used old cars, and because there's enough of that stuff around, they kind of were able to paint this picture of like, oh, well, this is modern day, but they're all wearing like crappy old clothing and driving like crappy 70s cars around.
Yeah, that's with Brad Pitt, right?
Yeah.
That's George Higgins.
George V. Higgins. That's right. Yeah.
Who wrote what's the movie with Robert Mitchum?
Friends of Eddie Coyle.
Yeah, Friends of Eddie Coyle, which I love.
Yeah, that's a great one. But yeah, I think that director, he's an Australian director. He did a great job. Dominic, his name is, I think, Andrew Dominic. Yeah, he did a really good job with that movie. He kind of kept the spirit of the book in the film, and did a good job with it. But both of those movies I really love. Yeah. And they're very faithful to the novels.
Well, I'm wondering, crime films and other kind of films, how much they play a role in your comics, because in reading through some of your older work, I mean, film and photography play a prominent role. I mean, there's the film school storyline in the Pete and Miriam stories. There's 8.5 Ghost, which is, it's a ghost story, fun one about making a film. And then there's photography and Perverso. So, I mean, is this something that you find coming out in your work often that you're aware of?
Yeah, it's very big. I would say even more so than the novels, because in my 20s I really wasn't much of a reader at all, and Clover Honey was an idea completely taken from North by Northwest. So, just this idea of like, well, if I have these two characters and one's chasing the other, then I can really like get into who these two characters are, and I don't have to worry about some, complicated plot. I can just kind of keep this simple and keep it to these two characters. But yeah, movies play a big role. They always have. I think more than any other genre, I love horror films, but I tend to still love the ones that were made 30, 40 years ago than any of the that are made now. But like I said, even Killing Them Softly, really impressed with that. And after so many crime films, it's still I feel like there's still some really great stuff out there. And yeah, that movie alone kind of gave me the idea of like, oh, well, I can, because I don't really love drawing. I'm not a big fan of drawing like modern day backdrops and things like that in my comics. And I tend to love 60s, 70s styles, and that movie, I was like, oh yeah, you can totally get away with this. You don't really have to say it's 1976. You don't have to say that, but you can. There's still enough around for you to paint a portrait like that and say, oh no, it's modern day. It's just these guys don't have a lot of money, or they're old, they're kind of set in their ways with their styles and the kind of cars that they like and the way they dress and all that. Quentin Tarantino has always been a big visual influence more than anything else.
Yeah, when I was in college, I drove a '72 Plymouth Fury that I kind of still wish I had, even though it was a piece of crap. But
Yeah.
it was a giant boat of a car that could take a hit.
Yeah.
But it felt, whenever I see that kind of '70s style, either in a movie from the '70s like The Friends of Eddie Coyle or trying to reproduce, it just reminds me of that car.
Yeah, and watching Tarantino movies like Death Proof, though actually something like that will influence me more as a writer than anything else, because when I hear about movies like that, I'm like, oh, okay, they're just doing Vanishing Point, and then you watch it and there's so much more going on.
Yeah.
And so I think about I like, there's all kinds of movies, very simplistic kind of exploitation movies, but I love that he can kind of put more into it there, kind of add another layer to something like that, and that's definitely been very influential, because it's really easy to just say, well, I love Plan 9 from Outer Space, I'm going to do a comic just like that. But when you've been writing and reading and trying to get better and better as a writer and trying to kind of stretch yourself, put yourself out there, there's always, you kind of re-examine that and say, okay, you like this, but why do you like it? And what else could you do with this? Kind of like analyze that a little bit and, come up with something different, something more singular.
Well, I mentioned earlier the film school storyline in the Pete and Miriam stories. Do you plan on getting back to Pete and Miriam? Because that seems like something that you could always come back to, something that's ongoing. And much as what you do in some of your other comics, they're not necessarily chronological in nature. In other words, we get them in various points of their lives at various ages, and it just strikes me as a fruitful ground for you to return to.
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever will, though. I don't know. I feel like that project, especially with the film school stuff, that maybe I was talking about, or maybe I was using my influence and love of movies maybe a little too much in the comic storyline. That was hard because it was. I'd spent a long time doing a lot of slice of life comics that were just, that were non-genre. And I feel like I just really didn't have a unique voice there. There were so many, there's so many cartoonists that have come before me that have kind of, they've written about these same things and they've done so much better. And I feel like I really just didn't have a unique voice. I know a lot of people did not like the Miriam stuff because they just thought it was way too similar to Dan Clowes' work or Chris Ware's or Jaime Hernandez, and that was always kind of like that always kind of discouraged me from working further in just the straight fiction realm. I just feel like again with so much material out there, kind of playing on the same subjects, I feel like I didn't really have much to add there. I feel like when I really pen myself in, like if I sit down and say, okay, I'm basically going to do a comic book that's going to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger's Commando. What I'm doing is I'm trying to simplify my ideas, because with a lot of that slice of life stuff, I had these grandiose plans, and it's just there's when you start out so big where you have all these things that you want to do, it's kind of hard to get to all that. You end up getting to a little bit of it, and sometimes when I'm writing things and I don't have a nice simple plan to begin with, I just kind of the story just gets kind of convoluted. It goes in too many different directions. But so now if I start out with a really simplistic idea, it seems like with me sitting down and writing and drawing something like that, I just naturally will try to make that into something more complex, or.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of your preface in the book Let's Hit the Road, which you describe as being autobiographical, but in the preface you say that there's something about autobiography in comics that, at least at that time, was turning you off because so many people were doing it, but you wanted to try your hand at that. So it sounds like you had somewhat mixed feelings about this, like you have mixed feelings about the slice of life kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I just think that it's not so much like people's reactions or bad reviews that I would get on a lot of that stuff that I did for Fantagraphics. It's more that I, a couple of years down the line, I would agree with people's, arguments about my work, and I just think, I'm trying to do my own thing here, but it's just it's hard working from that, just kind of working off, doing something slice of life that's just working off of your life experiences. I mean, I haven't had like a tremendously interesting upbringing or anything, a pretty middle class, boring kind of upbringing. And I just found that it was just really, I was always doubtful about it, but for some reason when I was in my 20s and 30s, I always thought, oh, well, I don't want to go back to crime because that's kind of like, because I want to be a real writer. I want to, read American graphic novel at some point, and just kind of a hard thing to let go of after so long. But as you get older, you kind of learn that, well, there's just certain things that people are good at. It doesn't matter how much you read or study a certain thing. There's some people are just good at one thing, or they're better at one thing than another, And once I started doing the crime and horror stuff under Recoil, I started self-publishing those comics. I mean, I was just having the greatest time once I had kind of gone back and just thought, I'll do the best that I can within the genres that I love working in.
That seems to be the path, right? Not to kind of try to sweat what everybody else is doing, but find the thing that you enjoy. Yeah,
and it was hard in my case because I felt like I was like a backwards David Mazzucchelli. I'm like, wait, but you're doing fiction. You're trying to do something literary or whatever tag you want to put on it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wouldn't that be going backwards to start working in genre again? And, I wasn't very happy working on a lot of that stuff, a lot of that slice of life stuff. And it just, after a while, I just said, I either have to quit doing this because, people are calling me a ripoff, or they're saying my work is terrible. It doesn't really seem like a lot of people on this side of the fence even really like my work either, aside from readers and reviewers. And I thought, I love doing crime and horror. Like, so either do what you can with that, or you have to quit. And so, I just thought, I'll have fun doing this stuff and, do the best to say the things that I want to say within these genres.
Now, you started off in your career by publishing with Fantagraphics and then alternative comics, and then you mentioned you did your self-published stuff with Recoil, but now you're at Image, and are you getting to feel over the past, I guess, couple of years now with both Dark Corridor and now the recent She-Wolf, that this is a publisher and a particular business model that fits your kind of storytelling right now?
Whoops, sorry. I should have turned my phone off. Let me just check this off. Sorry. I hope so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, so far it's been great. I don't feel like I'm being told to fit into any kind of model over there. Actually, the opposite. Whenever I send artwork to Eric Stevenson, if it's something kind of, to me, I'll do a cover design or something and say, oh, geez, that kind of looks like a small indie book. And he'll just say, oh, this looks great. I love it because it doesn't look like all this other stuff, all this other mainstream stuff out there. And I have the same amount of freedom as far as what I want to do with my books and what I'm writing as I would at Fantagraphics. So, yeah, the only difference is this past 2 years is the only time that I've ever was able to live solely off of doing comic books. So that's great.
Now, you mentioned other ideas that you had for stories after She-Wolf or in addition to She-Wolf. Anything you can tell us about those ideas?
I just have some notes. Like I said, I'm guessing She-Wolf seems to be doing really well. Actually, I just found out today that they've sold out of issue 1 and they're doing a second printing, which I did not expect. So seems to be doing pretty well. But I do have a science fiction idea that I'd like to get to after this one. Again, it's just in note form right now, but it's something I am really excited about. It kind of all at once came to me and reminded me of William Burroughs and Philip K. Dick and Jim Thompson, and just all these writers that I really love all at once. And I just thought, wow, how did all this stuff kind of just come to me in a science fiction idea? So yeah, I'm hoping to get to work at the end of the summer and flesh out that idea.
Now, will this be something that you'll do both the writing and the illustration, or have you considered working with another creator collaboratively?
I'll probably be doing, especially this. Again, all those writers are. I have such a similarities too. So I definitely will be writing and drawing the thing myself. Yeah, I'm really excited about it because I've had a few science fiction ideas in the past, but other people have gotten to those ideas before I could. I had an idea very similar to the Peter Bagg comic. I can't remember the name of his comic where it was like a virtual reality story.
Reset?
Yeah, something very similar to that. And I was like, I can't do that one. And then recently I had something that was pretty similar to the Patience book. So I was like, I have to scrap that as well. But this one is so weird and out there and strange and complicated that I don't think.
So wow, Klaus and Bagg are stealing your ideas.
They're stealing my ideas. I don't know how they're doing it. They're getting in my mind. I think it's both of those ideas were very first-person narrative, kind of back to that, we're basically following this one character and you're inside his brain this whole time. And those guys seem to write along that same level for the most part. You're dealing with one character, so.
Getting back to She-Wolf for a minute, one of the things you were talking about earlier with, how kind of using a 70s milieu in a movie like Killing Them Softly, even if it is kind of taking place in the present, this book has a real 80s feel, especially in Gabby's wardrobe. Now, I mean, I don't know if you can say, is this taking place in the 80s, or is this kind of, again, trying to just use that visual look in a story that's in a kind of timeless era?
Yeah, well, this time I actually, I thought I was actually going to set it it is set in the 80s, because that's when I went to school, and when I was in high school, rather. So I thought, I'm going to put this in my hometown in New Jersey and actually I'll set it in the 80s. That'll make it fun. And again, the 80s seem to be a big decade for horror movies, so that just seemed like the natural thing for that. And that was the other thing I found interesting was in those early scripts of She-Wolf, there was a lot of autobiographical stuff in there, but it didn't feel like it was it didn't remind me of my upbringing. And I said, it's strange. There's a lot in there from my family and friends that I went to school with and my experiences in high school. And I wonder why it just it feels weird. It feels fake. But when I wrote that surreal story, there were only pieces of those memories that remained in the story, and they seem so much more vivid now because I'm not trying to string all these things along into this narrative. They're just sort of dropped in there. So because I can never remember a full memory. You just have for me anyway, pieces of memories, especially of your youth, and so it feels more vivid, more real, even though there's just those little moments in there left from my childhood. So that was another interesting thing that came about from writing that. I said, wow, it's strange now how this feels more like those memories than when I tried to write a story directly connected to those few memories of mine.
Well, that's the feeling that comes across in this first issue, that you do get this kind of fragmented, multifaceted, almost impressionistic and surreal series of scenes that seem like memory fragments, but also seem really dreamlike. And I'm thinking of that scene where Gabby is called to the principal's office, and the principal seems to almost divide in two, right? There's the part of him that says to her, what he should say, and then the other, maybe darker principal that tells her what's really going on.
Yeah, and it's something I had a weird sixth sense about, even as a really little child. Like could always kind of tell when an adult was lying to me, right? Just by what they were saying. There was something they'd do with their eyes or something, or the tone of their voice, and that definitely went into that scene where it's like, well, this is what he's supposed to say, but this is kind of what he wants to say. This is what he really thinks.
And then immediately after that scene, I mean, you plunge us into Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah. Like I said, I hope that stuff works. A lot of that script, I think there was only, I don't even remember. Maybe there was one scene that's felt a little forced or just kind of a weird jump for me, and I kind of deleted. But that issue is pretty much faithful to that script that second run on that script that I wrote, and I just kind of followed it along. Didn't question it. The big thing to know about the first issue is that a lot of it is a dream, and it won't continue that way. I mean, of course, you have to kind of explain what's going on so that people can figure out what you're trying to say with the story as the story moves along. But certainly that first issue is almost entirely just one nightmare bleeding into another one.
Well, I know that both Andy and I met you, as we mentioned earlier, at Heroes Con about a week and a half ago, and you'd mentioned that there was quite a bit of interest in She-Wolf #1 there. What did you think of this year's convention, and what really stood out to you at Heroes Con?
I think it seemed like it was really well attended. I did do a bunch of panels, so I was getting up a little bit. But it was certainly busy for me. I was in my seat pretty much the whole time, except for when I went off to do the panels. I was pretty much sitting down and selling stuff the whole time. And I don't know. I don't know what really stood out. I do like that. A lot of indie cartoonists seem to be coming back to the show, and I have seen a lot of new people from either art students or new cartoonists that are at the show. But it seems like every time someone new comes to the show, they really enjoy it. So one thing I always find really interesting is that people think that's not really going to be the show for them because it kind of set up as a mainstream show, but everyone seems to do well and kind of have a good time there. So because there's enough interest on both sides, I think, for everyone to have a good experience.
Huh. That's interesting that you say that, because last year we met Sophie Goldstein, and that was her very first, and I guess only time being at Heroes Con. And one of the things she mentioned to us is that she had that impression as well. She thought that would be a much more mainstream show than what she had been used to, for instance, like SPX. But she was really pleased with the fact that it was a mix of more mainstreamy stuff, but also quite a bit of self-published and indie creators there as well.
Yeah, it's a really for a show that big. It's a very friendly show, to anybody that attends. And a lot of that has to do with the interest of the people coming to the show. I think a lot of the same people come year after year, and people have all kinds of interests. They're not just there to check out the mainstream stuff. They're there to see if there's something new that they can get. So
yeah, I feel like that's.
I feel like Atlanta needs to be a little bit more like that. There's a bunch of conventions in Atlanta, and they're all very mainstream. there aren't any really interesting shows here yet. Fluke, which is done in Athens, is kind of the more wider ranging comic shows in Georgia.
Yeah, I feel like you kind of nailed what I like about Heroes Con is that they've got Indie Island, and so you can go there and find new stuff or pick up things, especially a lot of self-published and new stuff that may not otherwise kind of show up on in someone's search through the previews catalog.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's down to Shelton, who runs the show and who runs the Heroes Aren't Hard to Find shop, because it's a great shop. There's a lot of stuff there for all kinds of readers, and they push things like Copra and self-published comics like Copra and Revenger. So I mean, like, they really get they get people interested in stuff outside of just the usual monthly mainstream comics. So
yeah, I know. I'm a Charlotte native, and one of the things I regret is that Heroes Aren't Hard to Find opened around the time that I was getting ready to leave North Carolina, or at least leave Charlotte. So I think I went in the shop maybe a couple of times before I moved in the mid-'80s. So I kind of missed out on it. But every time I go back to see family, I try to go by the shop.
Yeah, it's a great shop, and like I said, I think because people love that store and kind of they're able to like get people into different stuff. I think and then those people come to the show, and so I think that contributes to people who are smaller artists or smaller published artists that have a good experience there.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rich, if our listeners wanted to find out more about your work and what you're currently working on, your past comics as well, where can they go? Online.
Best place is to go to the Image Comics website. Aside from that, you can go to Facebook. I'm Rich Tommaso at Facebook, or at Rich Tommaso on Twitter is probably the best place.
So you don't have richtommaso.com anymore?
No, I think I have to wait a little while. I had problems with the people, like I paid to have my name, to have the URL, I paid the renewal fee on it, and they didn't, my website was down for like a month, and I kept calling them and saying, I just paid you to renew it for the next 2 years, and it's still down. And after so many phone calls, my website was still down, so I had to like get my money back from them. I had to like contact my bank and everything. So now they're kind of like holding my name hostage for like 2 years, and because they didn't like that I had to get my money back from them. But yeah, so there's no way for me to get the name back. So I should probably just launch a new site called Rich Tommaso Comics or something.
Mm-hmm. So they're tying up the domain richtommaso.com?
Yeah, they are. I keep checking. I keep going to different domain websites and checking to see if I can buy that name again. It's still not available. So
damn them. Well, we wish you luck in obtaining that domain once again. We also wish you a lot of luck with She-Wolf. We hope that this continues past issue number 4.
Yeah, thanks. I hope people stick it out. I know there's some people saying, like, this doesn't make sense, and it does make sense. If you kind of read along, and it'll make more sense as it goes along. But I hope they don't think I'm just doing something weird just to be weird.
Well, we enjoyed it, so
yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks for talking to us about this.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Yep. Well, that was a fun conversation where we got to talk to Rich about his new work with She-Wolf and Dark Order, but also some of his influences in comics and especially crime writing, and some of his earlier work as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I found really interesting is that he said at one point, and in so many words, that I guess genre as a starting point seems to be something that he's really good at, or he feels that he's really good at. 'Cause
Yeah.
he was talking about, the kind of more autobiographical slice of life stories. He's not too sure that he can do that well. But when it comes to crime, horror, and he also talked about, a future project with sci-fi, that's where he resonates.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a great time talking with Rich. We want to thank him again for coming on the Comics Alternative. And if you want to find great discounts on future issues of She-Wolf, then visit the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. You'll find wonderful discounts on not only Rich Tommaso's comics, but others as well. And after you do pre-order your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about this interview. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message from the comfort of your computer or mobile device by using SpeakPipe. It's very simple, easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn and Spotify. And if you're an Android user, you can listen to us via Google Play Music. But as always, you can listen to every single one of our episodes and read the various reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right, all the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. We had a great time with this interview, and we have more to come this summer, so check back. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.